We're going to be discussing one of, I think, the key topics of this moment when it comes to sustainable finance and the action of financial institutions on climate change, which is transition plans and transition planning. Needless to say that that is, at the moment, the buzzword in the sustainable finance space, and really, I would say, a practical but also a very political priority in many places around the world and for many institutions. And institutions, including banks, and particularly, of course, those banks that have made public pledges to either align with the Paris Agreement, or even those who have gone the extra mile or the extra step of fully committing to net zero portfolios by 2050, such as the banks that we have in the Net Zero Banking Alliance, two of which are on stage with us today. And so that's a little bit an intro here. What we will discuss today is what does this mean? What do these transition plans actually mean? How have first movers in the space, first moving banks, developed, or how are they still developing their transition plans? What do these transition plans look like? What do they contain? And what are challenges? And how do you overcome those challenges? Challenges in formulating internally those transition plans. Challenges in getting those approved, challenging in presenting those to stakeholders, but even more importantly, challenges in implementing that and operationalizing transition plans, of course. We have a great lineup of speakers. Let me just introduce the lineup really quickly. We have just to my left here, Alenka, Recelj, Mercina. I hope I'm not butchering that. You can correct me in a minute. Who's the head of sustainability at NLB. We have Angélica Afanador, who's director at Guidehouse and executive director of the Partnership for Carbon Accounting and Financials, PCAF. We have James Close, who's head of climate change at NatWest. And then we have José Blasco, who's global sustainability director of ACCIONA, of course, a local energy company here in Spain. So we have a good kind of representation here of European stakeholders when it comes to the issue of energy emissions, transition away from emissions into renewable energies and other alternatives. I wanted to just recap very quickly, yes, transition plans are the buzzword at the moment, but there's been a little bit of a history that has brought us here. And I think it's good for all of us to be there as to, why are we here at this point in time and where are we coming from? And so to understand where do we have to go next? Because 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, would someone have said financial institutions need to be developing comprehensive transition plans to transition their portfolios to net zero emissions? Or people would have been laughed at, or they would have been thought they're crazy. And yet here we are discussing this with mainstream institutions from across the continent. And I think the reason for this is we've witnessed in the last 7 years or so a true evolution in record time that was really kicked off, I would say, in 2017, just 7 years ago, through the TCFD. The TCFD came into force and it said financial institutions need to be looking at their climate risks systematically at portfolio level, forward-looking, science-based. And so that really got us going, and that accelerated this whole agenda quite a bit. But a few years later, in 2019 and then 2020, 2021, et cetera, there was this idea came up that, if you're a company, if you're a financial institution and you want to be a leader, a champion in this transition, it's not enough that you're a future taker. You need to become a future maker. So it's not enough that you're on top of your risks and opportunities that climate change throws at you. On top of that, you need to be thinking about how you're going to transition your portfolio into alignment with the societal objectives that we have. In this case, it's the Paris Agreement and net zero and all of that. And that happened in 2019 through the PRB, Principles for Responsible Banking, and through things such as the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, again, launched already 4 years ago. And since then, these commitments, what we've seen in the last 4 years then, since 2019, is commitments being operationalized, being put into targets. Now we have targets. All of you have set targets. Hundreds of financial institutions have set their near-term targets, decarbonization targets. And of course, the next big question in the room is, how do you reach those targets? And how do you convey to your stakeholders that you are going to reach, that you have confidence and you're confident and your management is confident that you will reach those targets? And that's the point of the transition plan that we want to discuss today. So without further ado, let me start perhaps with a question to you, Angélica. PCAF has obviously created and standardized carbon account, as per your name, carbon accounting for financial institutions. And arguably, that's the bedrock. You need to know what's the carbon in my portfolio to be able to set your target, develop your transition plan. But could you put that in your own words, the importance of that, of carbon accounting by financial institutions for their commitments, targets, and transition plans? What's been the PCAF role to date, and what are the next kind of challenges on the way that you're trying to tackle at the moment?
Thanks, Remco. I would like to pick on your introduction regarding 2013, where we were back then, and maybe the remark of perhaps thinking about these issues would have been portrayed as crazy, right? And PCAF was launched globally in 2019, but the idea of PCAF started in the Netherlands way before, 2015, and even prior to the Paris Agreement. And I do remember when I started working on this idea of globalization, we were looked at as crazy. Like, how in the world a financial institution, a bank, an asset manager, an insurance company will measure the climate impact of the portfolios? There is no data, there is no methodology. But that is the purpose of PCAF. So to your question, the purpose is to standardize, and why? So let's go back to that, the onset, where we were thinking, what is the solution for that? So in 2015, prior to the Paris Agreement, a lot of governments were thinking, how are we going to support those negotiations? And in the Netherlands, where PCAF was born, a lot of sectors gathered around the government to actually help the government come to Paris with a proposal on how to support that. And of course, the financial industry in the Netherlands committed, and they said, yes, we're going to do this, but they had no clue how to start. So that posed the question, how are we going to actually help our government in the Netherlands to transition, to get to those goals of decarbonization? And then, of course, the question is, how do we measure? Because if we want to manage that climate impact, we need to measure what the climate impact is at the moment. And so that, of course, make the follow-up question to us, what's the methodology? And when they did an assessment of the methodologies out there were financial institutions actually measuring climate impact, but there were methodologies all over the place. Organizations were doing it very differently. So then, of course, what PCAF tried to do is to standardize and harmonize, so filling that gap. And the purpose is, in effect, harmonization of the way financial institutions measure the climate impact of portfolios. And that started with the first concept of finance emissions, which then moved to insurance emissions. And those are the two standards at the moment that we have published. And to your question of how PCAF is advancing in that regard, last year, we had a second version of the finance emission standard, the first version of the insurance emission standard, and currently we are surveying the PCAF signatories to understand what's the demand in the market, what additional methodologies are needed, and we're going to start methodology development at the end of the third quarter of the year.
Super. Thanks very much, Angélica. And I have to say, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but you mentioned Paris. And you mentioned how there was this notion at Paris to say it's not enough to talk about territorial emissions, and it's not enough to talk just about the money that rich governments give to developing country governments, typically called climate finance. We need to be looking at the inner fabric of financial markets and aligning that with Paris, because if we do that, we will align the rest of the economy. And I didn't mention this, but the 2015 Paris Agreement actually was revolutionary in that it said 2-1-C, all financial flows, and governments committed to this. And all financial flows need to become consistent with Paris. And then you, of course, need to know, well, what does that mean at portfolio level? How do you measure it? And this is, of course, where this carbon accounting comes in, right?
Yes, and important to remember is, why are we here? Like, what are we talking about transition plans on the first place? And it's that goal of the Paris Agreement that in Article 3 is calling to financial institutions. Of course, it's calling to all of us, all industries, but because the subject is today on financial institutions, that Article 3 is asking financial institutions to help enable that transition, that goal, achieving that goal, and also align those financial flows to help that decarbonization happen. So that is the framework. That, let's not forget about that overarching purpose. And that transition planning now, it's a hot topic because it's about now taking into consideration what is it going to be implemented to actually get us there.
Super, thank you, Angélica. Let me turn now to our first bank, James. NatWest has been one of the first major banks to publish a transition plan. Can you tell us a bit as to how you went about producing that, and the internal hurdles that you had to overcome, bringing different parts of the business together, et cetera? Because, of course, transition plan, a lot easier said than done. There's a lot of change that will unlock within an organization. There's always a lot of anxiety when it comes to change within an organization. So how did you manage all of that?
Yeah, thank you, Remco, and thank you very much for inviting me in. It's been a great couple of days. I think some fantastic discussions and talks, and I do feel as though this is almost the pinnacle of it. How do you translate all that discussion into a plan? And I just wonder, which other organizations have, or any other organizations already produced a climate transition plan? Any others planning to produce a climate transition plan? You go on. Yeah. And planning to? So a few planning to. Okay, and still others thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, it is easier said than done, but I have to say it is a really great galvanizing force across the institution. And we started our journey 3 years ago when we put climate at the heart of our purpose-led strategy, and we committed to halving the climate impact of our financing by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2050. We then did a say on climate resolution, which was supported by 92.5% of those who voted in favour. And that basically gave us the mandate to create the climate transition plan. And I think that was very helpful because it wasn't just the head of climate change who thought this was a good idea and the CEO. This was a commitment we'd made to our shareholders. So it brought it all in, brought everybody into the discussion. We also put it into the executive comp as well, which helped focus minds. The other thing that we committed to 3 years ago was to putting forward our sector-based targets for validation by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And I think that also gave us quite a lot of credibility. It wasn't an easy task, but we did get them validated last December. And that's been very foundational, I think, not only in terms of what we do across the organization, but also what we disclose in that climate transition plan that we've produced. The climate transition plan really looks then to, it's embedded in the TCFD, which was a little bit of a challenge. We might come to that a little bit later on. But it really looks to bring to life the pillars of the strategy, which are getting our own house in order, so reducing our own footprint of emissions by 50% from a 2019 baseline by 2025. We're on track to deliver that. The second aspect of it was to end the most harmful activity, which is where we put many of our oil and gas and coal customers on notice that they would have to have credible transition plans if they were going to continue to bank with us. And as a result of that, we've exited some exposures, but we've also made some, I think, good judgments about who to continue to work with, and we've seen acquisition finance flow for businesses to acquire renewables businesses in North America, for example. And we've got a ratio, I think Eric referred to the work done by Bloomberg yesterday, where I think it's 0.92 is the average NZBA bank ratio of clean to brown financing, to use shorthand. Our ratio is 5.4, so it's one of the only bank, I think, that's above the 4.1 that GFAN suggests is required to get to 2030. Then the third pillar, and I think this is where it gets really interesting, is supporting our customers in the transition. And we made that part of our growth strategy that we announced in February. And that, again, has got some excitement around how this isn't just a matter of putting a hair shirt on and stopping banking people and making life difficult for everybody in the business, but also looking for the opportunities that sit around the transition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then the fourth thing I think that is very apparent to all of us, and we sit here together, I think, as a manifestation of the importance of building powerful partnerships so that organizations like ours can work together and also harness the great technology capability that's out there. So we partnered with fintechs and big techs to get better data and more accurate data. We're partnering with NGOs like WWF, and that whole concept of partnership, I think, is extremely relevant. And then, as a result of all of that, we've produced our climate transition plan. I think with a lot of support, a couple of things that made the difference on the support with, say, on climate resolution, but also sponsoring COP26. And we took all of the exec up to COP26 in Glasgow. And I think they really got the urgency and the importance of the transition that we're making. And I think it's impossible to ignore when you sit in that environment and you see the wholesale change that's going to happen globally, and you listen to the scientists reporting about how bad it's going to be if we don't really accelerate the transition. And you do get a bit of passion across the organization to do the right thing and to drive our purpose through the climate transition plan. So it was a phenomenally collective effort. We worked very closely with the CFO and the finance team who produced it, but it was really led through the board by the exec. And I think that's the four lessons that I would give across in terms of putting together a really great transition plan. I'd say the first one is to make sure you have that leadership from the top. The second thing I think that's really important is to make sure it's mainstreamed in the organization. And again, we've started to embed tools in our commercial and institutional franchise to help them make decisions around the way they're going to price the capital for their customers and how they're going to evaluate customers in terms of the reduction in their emissions intensity as well. The third thing, which won't come as a surprise to any of you, is the challenge around data. There is no complete data set. You have to work really, really hard to get fit-for-purpose data. And I would say that you have to acknowledge that the data you've got is going to be wrong, but it's going to be better than nothing. And again, I think one of the key things we've done in our climate transition plan is put out the PCAF scores for the data sets that we've got and built a plan to improve those PCAF scores over time. So envision that will get better over time. And of course, we're always looking for greater standardization. So we're very keen to see how ISB will play out, and also the data utility that GFANs have pushed forward. And then the final thing I would say is that banks approach their business through sectors. But of course, the transition isn't going to happen at a sectoral level. It happens at a systemic level. So one of the things we've challenged ourselves to do is to think about the gaps in the financing to enable the transition to happen, and what's going to happen systemically to enable those gaps to be filled. And that's where I think the opportunity comes in. And so we talk a lot about agriculture and food as a system, and we recognize that farmers are actually about 19% of the carbon on our balance sheet, about 3% of the exposure, but they're going to have to transform radically if we're going to be able to reduce the emissions in that part of the system. And the farmers can't do it by themselves. They need support from governments, which is where you get into policy advocacy. They need to tie into the supply chain, particularly the supermarkets, who are making commitments around halving the impact of their food baskets with the WWF, and also food producers as well. And we've got a great example of working with a food producer, McCain, who make potatoes, who make chips out of potatoes, and we're partnering with them to get the capital to the farmers more cheaply so that they can do regenerative things in terms of their potato production. Of course, that's massively appealing because that means that you can have low carbon chips and crisps, which there has to be some benefit from all of this hard work. So those are some of the things that are in the climate transition plan. Do have a look and a read of it. We think it's quite an easy read. I mean, it's a complex subject that we've tried to simplify, but it's really changing the way in which we think about the business and we get our capital to our customers, and also strategically how we're going to drive the business over time.
Thanks very much, James. I want to perhaps just highlight one point and then ask you a quick follow-up question, if that's okay. The first point is, I think you wrapped up a little bit by also talking about the system. This is not only about one bank or one company, or one sector even. This is about a systemic transition that only really regulators and policymakers can accomplish. Like, the finance sector alone, I think through all of this that we're doing here, we're showing our willingness. Finance is showing its willingness. It wants to be a constructive, party at the table, but finance is not going to solve climate change. And so, part of our thinking also at UNEP is to facilitate that, to broker that dialogue. We're seeing, to basically, show to governments that the finance sector is willing to commit, but that the finance sector needs the governments to commit to, and to get a positive, a virtuous cycle going. At the moment, I feel we've not done enough of it, but hopefully in the near or in the not too distant future, we can do a lot more of that. So I think that was my point. And I have one question, just also for the audience to understand a little bit. We're talking transition plans, and a lot has to do with the different categories, I guess, of transition finance. Of how can you how can you start categorizing transition finance, and GFANS has done a kind of a categorization exercise where basically you're financed through a carbon perspective. You can say there is finance that is already net zero aligned. If you're funding energy efficiency, if you're funding regenerative agriculture, if you're funding renewables, that's probably already done. Then you have we have the greening of the brown, as someone said yesterday. That's the transition finance. And I would say that is perhaps internally within the bank a little bit more controversial than the first one. Everyone will agree. It's like growth. We're going to grow in green markets. Who can have a problem with that? No one. The middle one, I think it's probably, probably client relationship managers would say, what, you're asking me to do yet another thing with my client. I'm already asking my client, many things, and now I need to start asking. And so, but it's still a growth story. So I think still, probably the pros outweigh the cons from an internal kind of perspective. But then you have the third bucket, which you also touched upon, which is basically technologies, business models that we know cannot transition, that we know they have no place in a net zero transition. And I guess that's where most of the probably resistance is. Am I right? Am I right in that? And was the types of things that the shareholder resolution that you had, was all of that enough to manage that, basically?
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly right, and I think that there's still a lot more work to do. So our kind of fundamental building block is something that we called climate sustainable finance and funding, and we committed to 100 billion to 2025 to get that out of the door. But it's our definition. We're not taking a standard from somebody else. We're applying the principles, and we're looking at it. And it's not just pure green, because some of this is sustainability-linked loans, and so it gets quite complicated. So the next step that we've looked at is exactly as you described. What is the pure green, and what is the transition? And then I think that puts a focus on the remainder, which is the ending harmful activity that you're trying to nudge into that transitional piece. Yeah. But again, there's some really difficult and complex lines to draw around it. So, for example, in our mortgage book, we've set ourselves an ambition of having 50% of it EPC, Energy Performance Certificate A to C, which is the UK measure for energy performance. But we're not going to walk away from people whose homes are EPC standards much lower than that. And some of those are not going to be able to invest in retrofitting to build them up to the standard. So we have to bring this is where I think the benefit of having a purpose-based decision framework helps a lot, because it doesn't purely become an ROI, return on tangible equity part of the question. It becomes what is socially useful for us to do as a bank. And then that takes you exactly into the space that you've described on the policy side of things.
Yeah.
So we go back to government and we say, look, we can't do this without a proper systematic program from government of support that's going to enable the UK's housing stock to improve its quality rapidly, more rapidly than is currently the case. And by the way, the UK has to do that because it's committed to net zero.
Yes.
It's got very ambitious NDC targets. So it creates the right tension, I think, with government. And it's also very good for our customers to hear that we're advocating on their behalf as well. But it is often comes into headwinds. I mean, particularly in the UK political cycle where, we've seen net zero start to be politicized. And in fact, we were leading an energy efficiency task force that was making some really great recommendations where I think government's, looking to sort of water it down or walk back from it. So you're exactly, the way that you've framed it is exactly right. The complexity is dealing with the challenges around it. And the point is that existing tools that we have for decision making need to be improved and enhanced by putting this net zero overlay on it, and also thinking about what it means in terms of, we use the word just transition, but how do we do it so that it's to the advantage of everybody in society? That's
right. Well, thanks again, James. And again, I think, if you and other members of the PRB of NISPA feel that, now is the time to start bringing things to government for the systemic, push, again, I think as UNEP through these platforms, I think we stand more than ready to, broker those dialogues as much as possible. But let me turn to our second bank on the panel. Alenka, and also if you could tell us about your climate journey to date, and in the same way, how you managed to get your colleagues across the business to actually, go this along with you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank UNEP for the invitation. It's for sure an honor to share the stage with such esteemed speakers and leaders and experts. Before I provide the answer to your question, at this point I would like to emphasize that in Europe we are observing several different speeds of convergence towards carbon neutral and sustainable economies. NLB Group is headquartered in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, and business-wise we are very much focused on the Balkan region. And today I will try to give my voice to countries from that region where the situation is like totally different compared to the western part of Europe and northern part of Europe. And I believe that we really must not forget that sustainable development should not leave anybody behind. And, we're quite often hearing words like green transition should be fair and equitable and so on. So it's really important to bring to the table people from that part of the world or from parts of the world that are lagging behind a little bit. So regarding NLB, our climate journey actually started in 2020. It was actually 15th of January. And I still remember the date because from that moment on, it's really hectic, I must say. It's been really an intense journey over the past few years. In 2020, we joined UNEP PRB In 2021, we published first climate-related financing targets. Then in 2022, we decided to join NZBA, and then our net zero project kicked off. We're still dealing with this project. I mean, we have a deadline to publish first interim targets at the end of this year, and it's been quite a journey. And this project of measuring the baseline and scope 3 emissions and setting first interim targets, it's really hard work. Well, regarding how we managed to get colleagues across the business to treat climate as a priority, I would say awareness. In that part of the world, I mean, I would say, especially not in Slovenia, but in Balkan region, namely Montenegro, Bosnia, Serbia, ESG topic, sustainability is not really very high on the agenda. So we're dealing with a totally different world. And I mean, we all believe that we should be super focused on knowledge and on information sharing, because only when people really understand what is it about and why it is super important to deal with these questions, only then they start really to work in the right direction. But I would also say that this harmonized stakeholders pressure can really speed up the whole process. We actually keep seeing our investors to be really passionate about climate issues. So this is really speeding up all the processes and so on. So yeah, a lot of things to do.
Thanks very much. And Alenka, and I think we are not, as UNEP or PRB, NISPA, all the work that we do is not meant to be and should not be, you know, kind of Scandinavian or Western European or something like that. I think we are set up to be, you know, as global as possible, including on carbon. I think the challenge is, did you point out that regions are, you know, and the banks within those regions are at different levels of maturity, understanding, size, all of that. You know, within Europe, and then also between Europe and the rest of the world, things get a lot more, you know, divergent, and all of that needs to be managed. You know, all of that, we still, I think, through UNEP, want to be pushing the envelope, want to deliver additionality on ambition, on alignment, on impact, but at the same time doing that in a way that is considerate of, you know, regional differences and also differences between the banks. We've now heard a lot from the finance sector, you know, colleagues and from financial institutions and supporters like Angélica and ourselves. But we have also a colleague from the real economy here, where, you know, the investment happens that needs to be financed, you know, for decarbonization, José Luis, and that's a little bit, you know, ultimately, decarbonization is in the real economy. Finance enables, supports, catalyzes, etc. What do you make of all of this discussion? You know, are the banks helpful to you? Have they been helpful to you? You know, what do you think are key things that banks in their transition plans should have that will make your life easier, you know, in decarbonizing energy, for instance, or electricity, etc.?
Oh, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think that the first thing that I perfectly understand the situation for the bank, because it's very confusing. You have a lot of frameworks, you have a lot of requirements, you have a lot of confusion. But let me reflect about what is happening now from the outside world, okay? They say, if you have a look about what is happening in this sector, you see two things. First is that the purpose-driven institutions like NatWest or others here are very pushy, they are very committed, they have strategies, they have included into the risk management, they have products, we have a lot of things. Also targets, but are they plans? No. Sorry, I admire what are you doing, but they're not plans, are strategies. Why we say that this is not plans? what kind of things we need to see in a bank in order to say that we have a plan. The first thing is that we have seen how the pushback in the middle of the political situation, you are stepping down for the G fund very quickly. What happened with the permanent, how we can introduce this into the AGM's decisions in order to keep a permanent commitment in the future. But the most important thing, if you have a plan, a real plan should be linked with the microprudential requirements. If this plan is not linked with the microprudential requirements, it's a strategy. It's okay, let me sit at the adults' table. But this is not a real systemic change. How I say this? Because the microprudential requirements in the regulation, for example, if you go through the article, I don't remember the article, but I think this is 502 of the CRR in the European legislation from microprudential requirements, you can introduce capital requirements differentiated for your investment when they are serving the primary goals of the society. How many of the banks or the financial institutions have really put their plans into the regulators in front of them and say, okay, guys, I am giving you a different spread for this kind of investment. And how I am pushing back, also penalizing the heavy emitters in order to give the market a clear signal that this is transitioning. We need 9.2 trillion in order to make the real greatest reallocation of capital in the economic history. If we want to make this, we cannot only trust on the great institutions like NatWest that will be a few, but we have another part of the world that never will be on board. I am wondering from the outside, reality check, if you are really committed with the decarbonization, put your requirements, put your policies, put your plans in front of the regulator in order to get cheaper money with less capital requirements. If this is true, you will be seated at the adult table. Meantime, you can make some noise, that this is fine, but this is not the real change. This is a real decarbonization plan for an institution. And I think that the regulation has the instrument, but we need to be serious about that. Basel IV is not, for example, Basel IV is not reflecting the CRR3 of the European requirements. We can push all together. UNEP, it could be a very good catalyzer in order to make it happen. If we are really serious on that, take the lead and goes to the Basel IV tables, these discussions, and say to the regulators that decarbonization, basic infrastructure, and all the things that we need in order to make it happen in real terms have a premium. Use the financial regulation for social purposes.
Thanks very much. Do the banks, James, do you want to respond to that? Does that sound, what do you make of that?
Well, look, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it would be great. I mean, we go and speak to our investors and we represent our climate transition plan and they think it's a great piece of work, but the share price doesn't move an inch. You know, we can do green bonds for our mortgage book and we get a little bit of benefit from that. But it doesn't necessarily recompense us for the discounts we're making for those green mortgages. So the regulators, and I think, you know, they haven't quite sort of got the balance right here between making sure that the businesses remain robust and resilient, but also acknowledging that they're going to be fundamentally different types of institutions given the scale of capital that's going to shift in the period of time that there is. So, you know, when we start to have that conversation, we think about what 2050 is going to look like and what 2030 is going to look like, and why a bank that makes decisions on the basis of carbon is going to be more resilient than the bank that doesn't. Now, until the regulators come along, we're doing that because we believe it's the right thing to do. And we also believe that in the long term, we'll get rewarded for it because we'll have a better bank and a far more resilient balance sheet. But it's a great point, and it's the system point. The system has to change all the way through. And the regulators, the policymakers have to recognize that we can drive the money to the real economy as banks. And if we do it properly, we should reduce the cost of capital for those that are making the transition.
So I see a lot of agreement there. And that's a good thing. That perhaps also, gives us a little bit a pointer as to what we should be talking about in the future and putting kind of, into the agendas of the future. I mean, I'm going to say, I look at Europe and the regulatory landscape in Europe, the financial regulatory landscape in Europe as it pertains to sustainability, and there's been a lot of progress, right, in the last 10 years, especially if you compare that also with, financial regulatory regimes in every other part of the world, right? There's a lot, but it's not at that level yet. It's still very much focused on risk disclosures. We're starting with, transition plan disclosures. It's not really gone into what you're talking about, capital requirements, but there's been a discourse. There's good arguments, there's, bad arguments, there's good arguments in favor, good arguments against that I hear from commentators. But yeah, we're not there yet, I think. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue those discussions and see, kind of what makes sense. But yeah, that's really useful, José Luis, that perspective. And I get the point of, if you really, really, really want to push it and be really, really, really serious, as a regulator, and if net zero is a whole of government type challenge, then those are the discussions that we need to continue having. Back a little bit to you, Angélica, on the data question. Data, I think, James, you mentioned is problematic still at this point. I think scope 1, scope 2, I mean, the bank's own scope 1, scope 2 are probably okay. Once you start looking at financed emissions in the scope, basically the scopes 1, 2, and 3 of your scope 3, right? There things get obviously quite messy at this point, but there are measures underway. It's improving. It's improving. But as that data landscape improves, how can banks cope with that over time? Because they then need to, now they're including only scope 2 emissions of their clients. Then over time, they may have to be including scope 3 emissions. And so it's almost like we need to manage the upside of enhancing data quality in the landscape. And what do you think about that? What's your thoughts about that? How should, from the PCAF perspective, kind of banks manage and other financial institutions manage that situation?
Well, my opinion first is that we should be celebrating that. So if data is becoming better, there is an opportunity here to celebrate that. And I mean, here in Europe, if you just think about Europe, the CSRD regulation, accompanied by the ESRS standard, is already pulling corporations or banks' clients to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions, right? So that means that it will become better or easier for financial institutions, for banks, to measure their finance emissions, because in effect it will be the attributing their exposure to those emissions of their clients. So in the medium long term, it will become easier. Of course, if that data is actual data from their clients, it will be higher PCAF score, better quality, and that will trigger most likely recalculation of the baseline. But in my view, a recalculation based on that trigger is actually good news. Now, what we should remind ourselves is that what's the purpose of doing target setting and transition planning? It's not for the sake of reporting. It's for the sake of achieving decarbonization in the real economy. So even though, for example, NatWest that has already a transition plan with different PCAF scores in their data quality, it's already engaging with their clients, and it's already trying to help those clients decarbonize. That is the focus. And if in 5-10 years they will have to recalculate their emissions baseline, I think that is okay, because what they will actually look into in addition to is whether they have achieved that decarbonization target. And it's not about the decarbonization in paper of the portfolio per se as it looks in numbers, but actually achieving the decarbonization of their clients. And that's what I would think transition finance comes in the picture. And we need methodologies on greenhouse gas accounting for transition finance to be able to avoid, well, not to avoid, but to be able to help those banks that are committing to engaging with clients in decarbonization to show results, to show proof that this is real, that is not greenwashing.
Thank you. We could obviously unpack this a lot more and go back and forth, and also, you know, if James or Alenka, if you want to comment on it.
I was good.
But perhaps to just be efficient with time, because we're running out, I'll ask the next question for you, James, and then you can combine, you know, the two answers for that, which is, we're discussing carbon here largely. You know, 2 hours ago in the same room, we had another panel discussing adaptation and how the transition to, you know, how, you know, banks and other FIs can transition to supporting their clients towards adapting to 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees that we have now, 2 degrees, et cetera. In the room next door, they were discussing nature. Probably yesterday there was a discussion about resource efficiency. So one question here is also, like, as financial institutions and banks are developing their decarbonization transition plans, like, you know, how can they kill several birds with one stone to a certain extent and start already kind of connecting the dots between carbon, nature, resilience, et cetera, in a way that's just not totally overwhelming for everyone involved?
Yeah, well, and I think I can answer the point I was going to make around is also, you know, as banks, we can be proactive in getting data into the hands of our customers. So we've developed a carbon footprinting tool that we apply for small and medium-sized enterprises. It was its year anniversary. It's got an uptake of about 5,000 SMEs, which is pretty good, and they're really engaging with it a lot. So, you know, it builds a deeper relationship with our customer. And of course, we don't just stop on the carbon footprinting. We can look at nature-related issues, adaptation-related issues. And I think the same is true for us as an organization, because we've just agreed with the board a nature and biodiversity strategy where we're going to apply the same principles of ending harmful activity, getting our own house in order, helping our customers and building partnerships. The challenge, I mean, the reason why I kind of like carbon, I mean, not because I've been working on it for a very long time, is because you can measure it, and you can, so it brings it to life through a single measure with carbon dioxide equivalent. Doesn't mean that it's easy to do that, or it's not still nuanced and complicated in terms of how you interpret it. But nature and biodiversity, there are so many different measures that you can use. And then it gets even more complex when you get into the social side of things. And I think that the way I regard this a little bit is we're on the journey to make better decisions as organizations for the, you know, public good and pricing in externalities. If we can start with carbon and climate, then we can build into the next ones, and we don't need quite so much as a single measure, because our judgment would have improved because the way we've embedded these decisions in the way in which we do business. So it isn't easy. I mean, I do think carbon's the obvious place to start, but regard it as practice for making better decisions around externalities and making, you know, the work that we do as banks socially useful.
Oh, thanks very much again for that. Not much time left, and still a few questions here. The next one was for you again, Alenka, and just if you started doing this during your first answer, but if you could give us a little bit more a feel for, you know, how in your region, you know, what the key drivers are for all of this, the opportunities, the barriers, you know, to the transition. You know, that would be really useful in terms of, you know, others also seeing, you know, perhaps, they're not totally different in Spain or totally different in other parts of Europe. But yeah, I think if you could, you know, reflect a little as to your own regional context for all of this, that would be really useful.
Yeah, well, firstly, I would say that Slovenia and South European region, Southeastern European region is, of course, open economy connected to buyers, suppliers from all over the world. And we see a lot of net zero requirements coming from large companies, large global companies, and those are being slowly transmitted to these countries as well. I know that we're not doing net zero because of reporting, but still reporting, it really helps to steer next steps. Let's say NLB, of course, is regarded, I would say, as a strong catalyst of change in the Balkan region. And yeah, we're trying to work with companies, with countries as well. And we see that they started to embrace the net zero journey. We see some slow changes in business models and so on. But we must not forget that the region, you know, if we go from Serbia and then if we go, you know, to the southern part towards Macedonia, Montenegro, and of course Albania. These countries are historically tied to coal, and a majority among these countries are not even members of the European Union. So their regulatory and legislation environment is definitely not aligned with the EU. And what is more, if you look at the BDP per capita in Balkan region, it is the lowest in Europe. So how can we really expect that they will follow the pace? It's really hard. But with regard to green transition, I mean, it's not everything bad and gloomy, but with regard to green transition and green financing there, I mean, our bank sees a lot of opportunities in this region, especially renewable energy projects are there. Projects are running a little bit slow because of obstacles related to electricity, distribution networks, because of, you know, infrastructure issues and so on. So all other sustainability related projects are actually rare. So this is a little bit of a problem. It is estimated actually in the region that national economies will on average direct 1/5 of their investments to green transition, which means approximately 2 to 3% of their GDP. Most investments are expected in renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydropower plants, and so on. We estimated that it will be approximately 43% of all green investments into renewable energy sources. Then this will be followed by investments in green transport. Approximately 16% of all green investments will be in green transport, and then energy efficiency around 18% of all investments. And then at the end comes low energy buildings with around 15% of all green investments. We expect that most investments will be done in Slovenia, Serbia, and North Macedonia. And we're looking forward to support this region for sure, very much.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you said, you know, really, you know, I've seen that being a challenge in many parts of the world. It's very unsurprising, very natural, which is many parts of the world rely historically and still today on coal and other fossil fuels, and on top, they have developed, you know, they still have like low income affordability issues. The only real solution that I've seen come through for those situations is that of managed phase out, where it's basically one says, look, you know, I think we need to phase those assets out prematurely. You know, they're not going to disappear, even if the investors don't own them anymore, even if the banks don't finance them anymore, the assets will probably stay. We need to phase them down prematurely, and that, of course, that the private sector cannot do by itself. It can only be a public-private and, you know, joint endeavor. That's the point of the JET piece, and now we're seeing JET piece, you know, in I don't think in the Balkans or in Southeast Europe, but in certain parts of Africa and Asia. And I think, and hopefully, I'm hoping that that model really starts working out and delivering results, because, and so that it can be replicated globally. But that's really, really a tough issue.
If I may, I mean, yeah, precisely what you said. I mean, we should also be very much aware that this comes with, I would say, a social bomb a little bit, you know, because there's really a big part of economy that is tied to coal.
Yeah.
And transition plans, you know, transition, this word is so important. I mean, to help these economies and to help these people and to not leave them behind, this will be very important. So, I mean, the northern and western part of Europe can do a lot. The picture can be really nice, but, you know, these are the parts of the world where you know, where things happen in different direction or with different pace. So we have to be really careful.
And I think the point is, this jet piece, for instance, it's not only about the public being involved, because the public, of course, in many of these countries also lacks the means. You know, even the public authorities don't have the means to, you know, ensure a just transition or, you know, do this premature decommissioning of fossil fuel assets. That's why it needs to happen also in you know, embed, you know, as a, with the international community embedded, with kind of, you know, so that the international community, of course, you know, donor countries are there to support, you know, the transition in a way that is just to the most vulnerable populations. But I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but we can take this offline. I had one more question, the final question for you, José Luis, which is, I think we will find this easy, but it's just like to finish up on an easy note, and a note that might actually, you know, bring us all together, which is, how do we get more money into green? You know, I think you said, James, you know, NatWest outperforming, you know, in that regard, you know, many other banks in the world. Congrats for that. We need the ratio of 4-to-1. So by 2030, for every dollar that goes into fossil fuels, we need $4 of investment going into renewables. Obviously, we're not there yet. How can utilities, IPPs, banks, investors work together in really, really accelerating deployment of renewables and perhaps even other low carbon energy? What's your 2 or 3 kind of collaboration ideas?
Yeah, but very, very, very easy. I think that this is nothing, because
that's easy.
That easy. It is happening now. It's happening without any doubt. You don't need to. We need to focus on other things like nature that my colleague has mentioned, or the part in terms of justice and social infrastructure, because energy is the most smart things that you can do is make it renewable. And this is very easy because it's cleaner, it's cheaper, gives you independence. But the problem is that we are very, very good in most, only 50% of the current population has the 80% of the current capacity in renewables. We have 120 countries with an insignificant capacity in renewables. The problem is that in those countries, probably they have other monopoly and regulatory requirements that not allow that the people get the freedom. And I think that renewables equals freedom. And I think this is only a question of time, because it's clever, simply clever. We will have electric vehicles because we will be cheaper than a fossil fuel. Why? Because our electric car has 500 parts and a fossil fuel 5,000. It's clever. This is not a question of that. We need to think in the second generation, what happened when we are investing a very low profitability, because when the energy will be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and who will be the investor who has more risk in these high-risk countries without the appropriate framework. And I think that we need to talk about the post-2030, what happened when we will have very small EBDAs for this kind of transformation in these countries, the risking. and these kind of things. And only very quickly, I think that the main thing that we need to also to talk is that we cannot fall into the carbon tunnel vision.
Yes.
There are more things to do. We can learn from the lessons from decarbonization, but it's only the first step.
I knew we could end with you on a positive note like that on the renewable energy story. So thank you for that, and I fully agree. And you also pointed out what's important is not only for managed phase-out in developing countries, but also for giving that freedom to people through renewable energies in developing countries, that we need to be smarter in terms of using public finance to de-risk and mobilize private finance. And on that note, we don't have time for questions, but the panelists are around, so catch them if you have questions, and have a drink, as I promised at the beginning. Now the doors will be unlocked, and you can go out and have a drink with the panelists and to cover your questions. Thank you very much, everyone.